I teach at Columbia in the School of Social Work, and Columbia University in New York, whose sister school, I don't know if that's how it's officially referred to, Barnard, which is part of the Columbia, under the Columbia umbrella. Faculty, staff, and students who have been standing up against the ethnic cleansing and bloody genocide of the human people who live in Gaza and the West Bank, um, have been met with a lot of obstacles when it comes to free speech, on campus and off campus as well. And so I do have a network of folks that I reach out to who are doing some really great work and putting wonderful lectures together, who are involved in the protest movements, and who can offer a little more insight into what's going on campus and off campus. And also, um, Shayoni, if I'm saying your name right, Mitra, who's going to be joining us, does some very interesting things with alternatives to street, not instead of, but things to do in addition to street protest, using art and expression, because we've got to get our message out across all aspects of life in a multidimensional way. There's many ways that we can do this, and she's got some unique insight into that, and also because she teaches on Barnard campus, some insight into some of the ways that free speech has been suppressed. Just a reminder, they changed rules. The schools changed the rules about how to have an event just when Free Palestine or ceasefire now protesters started popping up, because they didn't want our voices there.
So, Shayoni, can you tell us just sort of like what are the sort of work you do, your experience on campus? Like, what are you seeing on campus in this debate about whether it's free speech versus anti-Semitism that's going on these college campuses? So if you could speak to any of that, please.
Thank you. And yes, all of it, actually, in terms of just how Barnard and Columbia have been, in some senses, really a battleground around these issues, around campus protest, academic freedom, free speech. We have a task force on anti-Semitism, which hasn't defined what anti-Semitism is. But, all of this, I think, has really been brought to a head since October 7th, and very quickly when our student groups, SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Jewish Voices for Peace, JVP, sort of started having protests on campus, and there were counter-protests. But things really came to a head, I think November 10th is when Columbia suspended these two student groups for a walkout the day before on November 9th, citing unauthorized protest. And sort of at the time, they had used this language of these student groups were using threatening and intimidating rhetoric. Since then, they've sort of backed away from that claim a little bit, because when pressed to say exactly what is intimidating or threatening, they haven't really been able to define it. The VP, Gerald Roseberg, was asked this at the Columbia Senate, and he kind of, wouldn't provide examples. But the fact is that those student groups still remain suspended, even though the events policy that they were found in violation of was, as Anthony pointed out, changed before, without notifying anyone, without consulting all the shared governance procedures we have, including the faculty senate. They quietly changed the policy, found the groups to be in violation of them, suspended these groups. And since then, they've actually, in February, both Columbia and Barnard have issued new policies. But they have refused to reverse these suspensions of these student groups. So I think there has been a lot of organizing by students, faculty, and staff around these issues. There is now a Columbia Apartheid Divest, which has over 100. I think, last time I checked, about 130 sort of different groups on campus that have signed on. And so I think people are really, really concerned about all of these issues, both around Palestine. Why can't we say, why is even saying Palestine or saying certain slogans seen as threatening? And around broader questions of sort of academic speech and really freedom of expression.
And what I see from when I watch the protests on college campuses, and Anthony and I have been in conversation about this before, what I hear is just a lot of, I don't know if I would describe it as enthusiasm, but at least is enthusiasm for wanting to end this genocide. But I'm curious to hear what both of you, since both of you have experience in this area with this college campus anti-Semitism accusations. I want to hear what your reaction is to what Morning Joe says about this very topic. It's sort of off the wall, but let's listen, because this is what the Israel lobby wants to push against what's actually going on, which is just young people wanting to stop a genocide. And the phrases they're using to articulate that they want to stop this genocide is scary to Zionists, because it kind of interrupts their colonial plan. But I do want both of you to hear this. It's probably about 2 or 3 minutes, and then just to get your reaction on their description of what they say is happening on college campuses.
We're talking about far-right anti-Semitism. Sad fact is we have it on the far right. We have it on the far left. And we have it, and I hear it all the time on college campuses. It has gotten so extreme on many college campuses. I've heard firsthand, you can't even talk about a two-state solution without being accused of being a Zionist. You can't talk about peace between the Palestinians and the Jews without being called a Zionist. Jonathan Chait wrote this for New York Magazine. This week, the president of the main pro-Palestinian student group at the University of Michigan shared and then deleted a social media message saying this: "Until my last breath, I will utter death to every single individual who supports the Zionist state. Death and more. Death and worse." University sent an email denouncing the message. While she may be an undergrad, this student's hardly anonymous. She was one of 4 undergraduates to receive the University of Michigan's Dr. Martin Luther King Spirit Award, honoring students, quote, "who best exemplify the leadership and extraordinary vision of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr." It's absolutely bizarre. There's nobody that is less in line with the message of Dr. Martin Luther King than somebody that would talk about death and more, death and worse. Last month, the New York Times jointly profiled her and a pro-Israel activist in a story presenting both as searching for common humanity. As dusk neared, they walked alone to a nearby campus building and sat together on a bench. Maybe this would be the chance to recognize one another's humanity, the Times reported. He needed to know why anti-Israel protesters had not forcefully condemned the deaths of Israeli civilians. As Jonathan Chait said, I think that mystery has been cleared up. And Donnie, you cannot, on college campuses, on elite college campuses, it is hard to even bring up what happened on October 7th without being called a Zionist. It is hard for a student to not get canceled if they bring up the horrors of what happened on October 7th. There is in so many of these groups on college campuses, and I've seen it firsthand, I've heard about it firsthand, there's not just a plea, and I think a plea that we would all agree with, to save civilian lives in Gaza. There is an underlying hatred for Israel that's been there for years. I talked about turning.
And I'm going to pause it here because there's a lot to take in there. And I will start with our guest. You're not considered a guest, Anthony. Right now, you're a co-host. So I'll start with our guest to get your reaction. It does what Morning Joe says here in this segment so far, and I'm gonna bring up back up in a little bit because they go on and say more. Donnie Deutsch. Does it ring true to what you're seeing, and how would you react to, or how would you respond to what Joe says there? Joe Scarborough says there.
I think, firstly, recognizing that what he is saying is part of a larger tactic, which is this constant feeling that there is unchecked sort of anti-Semitism and calls for violence against Israel or Israeli supporting students. And I would say, look at our example. We have a task force on anti-Semitism, which has a lot of resources put behind it, by the way, institutional resources. But we do not have a commensurate task force on anti-Arab, Palestinian, or Muslim hate. And one of the things we have to keep sort of reiterating is a lot of students are facing hate attacks, violence, bullying, and none of us condone any of it. But when you put institutional resources behind investigating only certain kinds of claims and not those made by pro-Palestinian students, pro-Arab students, pro-Muslim students, who are facing incredible threatening, not just rhetoric, but actually violence, then what are your institutional commitments to the entire student body or the safety of everybody? And, we have, they will say that there are sort of ways of registering complaints. We have, at the Barnard side of it, we have been given some data, and they seem to be roughly the same number of complaints. But we're not seeing the same institutional commitments to investigating all sort of threats. I will say, at the Barnard side, we saw a transit workers union letter that the president of the transit workers union wrote on behalf of public safety at Barnard College, because 4 public safety officers complained against their supervisor, saying that one of the things that has happened since November is we have militarized our campuses. We have shut down gates, we've put up barriers, we've made it swipe entry, and this has all been under the sort of broader sort of really concern out of safety. Even though it's been pointed out numerous times that kind of militarized surveillance sort of strategy only makes our Black and brown students more vulnerable, right? Who doesn't feel invited or comfortable when they see a phalanx of NYPD standing outside your gates? So we've pointed this out many, many times. But this transit workers union sort of letter to our president said that, one of these supervisors at one of these gate checks had made a remark saying, we should, there were a couple of our students wearing hijab, saying, well, they should remove it. And not only did this supervisor not get chastised, her reportees, these public safety officers, had to raise this issue through their union. Mm-hmm. Why is that not on Morning Joe? Why are so many other questions around our students who are facing equal amounts of harassment or death threats or doxing? We're just not hearing those. So I think part of this is really just how one-sided it is, and people really are able to see how one-sided this is.
That is a great point. And Anthony, I'll bring you in for your reaction. Also, but I just don't know what their end game is. Like, do you believe the people who are protesting are eventually going to go, I am now for genocide, I am now for occupation? I don't understand what is their end game, even with all of these things that's not going to change consciousness. But Anthony, go ahead with your reaction to what was said on Morning Joe. If you remember, he he's basically describing anti-Semitism. I just don't, what he described, how his depiction of things It's just not what I personally have seen on the college campuses of USC and UCLA with some protests that I've seen. I just haven't seen what. What say you? What is your reaction to Joe Scarborough's description of what's happening on college campuses?
This is not unlike the messaging of George W. Bush during the wars against the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then which eventually were broadened throughout the Middle East region, when he basically said, anybody who questions what we're doing there, you're anti-American. So it's this very simplistic, jargonistic way of looking at freedom of expression and different viewpoints. Now the messaging is, and Morning Joe is, encapsulating that in everything they do. If you question Israel, if you question the government of Israel, if you question their apartheid policies, you hate the Jews. Those two things, I mean, we have to keep saying this. The majority of people who identify, and also identifying correctly, labeling somebody who believes in Zionism, which is a political philosophy, identifying them as a Zionist is now a slur. This is literally what they believe. If you believe in what you believe and you believe you're right, stand up for it. Let's talk about it. Not even allowed to use the label. And what they're doing is it's this, if you're not with us, you're against us. There needs to be pushback on this. Thankfully, we have social media. Thankfully, 19, 20, and 21-year-olds and beyond are on TikTok talking about this and saying this is ludicrous. What's very upsetting to me is that my campus and other campuses, which are supposed to be places where speech is freely given and where people debate issues, that's the whole idea of a university education, to be exposed to things that you're not necessarily comfortable with. And what they're basically saying is there is one form of acceptable speech and there's one type of acceptable victim. The speech that we prefer is speech that supports Israel no matter what their government and their military does to the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank. Oh, and to the people of Lebanon too. Let's not forget.
Anthony, I'm sorry. I thought you were. Sorry to cut you off, but let me just ask you this question. I'm not meaning by the sheer asking of the question to point out your age or anything, but what would you say the last huge sort of college sustained protest was the Vietnam War? And what was the state reaction to that? Because I don't have a recollection of that. Like, what do you recall it being sort of these clamped down sort of
Jay,
measures, these repressive sort of measures? But go ahead.
I'm not that old, Jay. But I was very
But even if you know it knowledgeable, you may have read about it.
absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's just say the National Guard in Ohio at Kent State University shot and killed 4 peaceful protesting students who were protesting against the war in Vietnam. They were beating them with those wooden sticks, those clubs. They were hosing people. So that reaction was very, very virulent, contrasted with the reaction of students who in the 1980s organized against the apartheid system of South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
We were not met with the same type of derision, and there was a very successful divestment movement, which worked. South Africa is no longer an apartheid state. Nelson Mandela was released from prison and became president of that nation, a nation which he was in prison for like 27 years. So, and he was labeled a terrorist by the United States. That divestment movement didn't get that same type of pushback. What we're seeing here is there's only one type of speech allowed, and that is speech that is in agreement with the genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes that are going on daily, perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, more so in Gaza now, but there's a lot going on in the West Bank too, the media doesn't like to talk about. And also, there's only one kind of acceptable victim. Let me just clearly say, and we shouldn't have to say this, and we all agree on this. Like, if anybody's a victim of anti-Semitism, is ugly. It's an ugly, horrendous, horrific thing. So is anti-black racism. So is misogyny. So is anti-queer hate. We can go down the list of all those things that marginalize folks and dehumanize them. And Islamophobia, I prefer to use the term anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim or anti-Arab hate, is disgusting. Um, these things, all types of hate, are horrible. When a university only has a task force to look at one of them, there is a very clear message. And the clear message is, you remember the Supreme Court in the 1800s with the decision that, black Americans were 3/5 human. This is what we're talking about. The United States has engaged in wholesale slaughter in the Middle East, up to 1 million people killed in our multiple wars for years, over the past 20 years. And now we're supporting this genocide and we're arming it. And Biden sent weapons to them every 36 hours. He just sent 1,800,
Yeah, I was gonna say he just sent some.
2,000-pound bunker buster bombs, which will be used, hopefully not. I mean, maybe there'll be a miracle, but they are intended to do to Rafah what Israel has done to the entire north, mid, and south of Gaza. We know that's what's happening. We're not allowed to talk about that on campus. We've got students that are being chided by their professors for using a Palestinian flag emoji in a group chat. Like, when I hear students say in the lawsuit that came forward, the university isn't keeping us safe, they're saying, because we're hearing chants from the river to the what. And I don't know what your algorithm does here, so I'm just trying to be conscious of YouTube.
Yeah.
Chants
Thank you for
free
doing that. Yeah.
Palestine, right? I don't need. It's not the job, and I tell this to my students. My job is not to make you feel safe. I want you to be safe, right? But you're not unsafe in hearing things you don't like. There's a particular professor in the business department, and I'm not even going to say his name just because he likes it when his name gets said, so we won't do it. Who's freaking out about all these campus protests? Like, I'm from New York City, right? I've lived in New York my whole life. How many times have I walked by people who are protesting or saying things I don't like or agree with? This is New York. Walk across the street. You don't have to listen. You don't have to agree, but you don't get to shut down speech. And also, these students, and Shayoni, can talk about this, were attacked by other students with a chemical weapon that is banned in the United States, a military grade weapon that only could have come from Israel, if it is indeed skunk water. That the NYPD and the Columbia administration are still investigating. This is a terrorist attack. I mean, you can say what you want, but when you start engaging in that behavior and you don't keep those students safe, what precedents are you setting? It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to bring up the display. I had to put it into basically load it into the system. That's why it popped up, but I'll put it up now. This is the graphic or the image that you DM'd me, Shayoni. Did you want to go ahead and describe what it is and speak about it?
Yes. And this is, it picks up on everything Anthony is saying, is what is the difference between feeling unsafe and being unsafe? And this is a discussion that college administrators, in my mind, are refusing to have, because I think a really good example of this sort of a clampdown on freedom of expression and free speech on campus is this Barnard policy against decorations on dorm doors. And, our Dean of Students sent out an email on, I believe, February 23rd, saying, you have a week, remove everything from your dorm doors, or we will remove it for you. And in that email, it basically said you have to remove everything. There is not any distinction because it was all seen as personal expression. And so it's a new policy of removing all signage from doors. Why? Because some doors had some stickers or slogans that made some other students feel uncomfortable, and they had to walk around those or take a different route. This has rightfully received, I think, pushback from really all quarters. We have heard from students, of course, faculty, alumni. We have, many social media posts on Instagram and others saying that, look, when I was in college, I was finding my identity. I was putting up flags. I was signaling things that I was becoming politically interested in. And that is part of the college process. And so to say that this is not a space for learning, this is not a space for self-exploration, this is not a space for sort of figuring things out, it's just so crazy. And so what I have, and I share this obviously with permission, Izzy Lapidus is this amazing sort of Barnard Senior, they sent this to me, because since November, a few of us have been running something called the Palestine Poetry Collective. And the idea really was, and maybe we'll have time to sort of share our website here, but the idea was that we're all going to protests, we're attending lectures, teach-ins, et cetera, but we need to have a space, a quiet, and this goes back to how Anthony was sort of introducing me, that we can do both. We can go to protests, and we can also make spaces for slow learning, close reading, coming together. So we have been having these weekly really congregations. It's very informal. Whoever wants to can drop in. We try and, sit on the lawns, or when it was cold, we'd go to a lobby and we read together. And in one of those, we read this incredible poem, which is called Today My Body Was TV Massacred. And we read it together. And Izzy went back and she said, I couldn't get this poem out of my mind. And so I felt compelled to write it out on this cardboard that I found lying around. And that's what she has on her dorm door. And to me, it is such a beautiful instance of student learning. You're learning something, you're processing it, you can't get it out of your mind. It's embodied knowledge where you're writing out poetry. This is what we want our students to know. And instead, you're having a policy which says you must remove all of this. We are undoing the experiences that, as faculty and staff, we're trying to give our students these experiences. Let's experience literature from different parts of the world. Let's find ways of finding art and other creative expression that has talked about genocidal violence, that has talked about settler colonialism, that has talked about the histories and deeply sort of violent histories of colonialism. Let's find safe and spaces of talking about these things. But when you remove all of these opportunities of learning, I think you're fundamentally going against what university education is supposed to do.
Absolutely.
This is what I mean. Like, I feel so strongly about this. These kind of clampdowns are actually not making anybody safer. You are, in fact, removing all of the risk and all of the beauty of encountering things that you didn't know before. That's why we go to university, not to have everything we like affirmation that we already came in knowing, but we actually want to encounter new knowledge.
And also, go ahead, Jay.
I was just gonna say the Zionist lobby. Before this, I knew about AIPAC. I knew about just the Zionist, the broader Zionist lobby. I did not know they had this kind of power to just overnight have universities walk in lockstep with Zionist guardrails. Let's say that, like, the Zionists don't want to feel uncomfortable at college campuses, so they put these guardrails up. Take this off of your dorm room. Like, I remember being in college at Cal State Long Beach. And I remember as far as back as I was in high school and I was in this college preparatory program where I would stay in dorms over the summer, and it was with college students and RAs and all that to give us the experience for what we was about to experience. And I remember that distinctly. The dorm doors were all decorated and they were all different. That was people's, now that I look at it, I just thought, oh, it's unique. But no, that was the expression of whoever was living in that room. So that, that's my anecdotal story to that is being true. But go ahead, Anthony.
Sorry, and Jay, if I could add one more
Yeah,
thing,
go ahead.
not only
go ahead.
not only is it that they're asking students to remove these things, again, deputizing public safety officers to do this, who themselves may not necessarily feel that this is the way to do it, but they've also asked RAs to enforce this policy, and the RA union was not consulted, right? And they're like, we don't have training, we don't want to do this, but the administration top down is able to enact policy that then every other arm of the university is sort of corralled into navigating or policing for them. And there is no process to ask the community, is this for the betterment of the community? Do we have consensus? Do we agree? Is this what people want? And what we are hearing is nobody wants this policy. Nobody wants this policy, and yet it's being enforced.
And we all, just to be clear, there's one reason it's being enforced. Well, maybe two. One, they want to look good to the people that are complaining and making this big heyday about campus dissent. See, we're doing something. But also, what if a couple of students were offended? I mean, I'm seeing the same type of fragility around the issue of talking about the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestine as I did when folks were reacting with fragility to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
Like, I know it makes you uncomfortable, but discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing. And by the way, you don't have to change your mind. But you are living on a planet with other people who are compassionate, loving, committed, and intelligent, and may see the world through a different lens than you. And I don't, nowhere have I seen anyone try to shut down the speech of those who support what's going on. Early on, when that particular professor that I've mentioned from the Columbia Business School was going on and on about things, he was targeting students. And I went on I don't do it anymore, but I went on his Twitter and I said, look, you can believe anything you want. Anyone's allowed to express themselves. Stop harassing students. There's another thing too, and that is sometimes all we have is our voice. The feeling of helplessness when you look at what's going on in the world can be very heavy, which is why what Shayoni is talking about with these reading circles and poetry and support is so important, because I believe art heals and meeting and being part of community heals as well. But when we feel the weight of what is going on and we see images of people, we've all seen them. It's devastating. That feeling of helplessness, like, what can I do? Sometimes putting a flag or a poem on your dorm room door is the one way you can stand up and say, I am human. This is my heart. This is what I believe. And for the university to say, no, somebody might be uncomfortable with your humanity, with your expression, with the lens with which you look at the world, is the opposite of the mandate of what a university education is supposed to be about. And I think in very significant ways is traumatizing. And for all those who are defying it, who are defying these rules on a daily basis, what I call little rebellions, thank you.
And this is, Jay, you started this segment saying, I didn't know that there was such powerful lobbies behind these kinds of things, right? We also have to go into this election cycle, and I agree with everything that was being sort of said before I joined, even of what really are our options if we are anti-genocidal in our politics. What options does the 2024 election sort of present for us? But let's also not be naive in thinking that this will be the only attack on higher ed. There will be, what if tomorrow, and we know these are coming, there is a slew of anti-LGBTQ legislation currently active in the country. There's a slew of anti-trans legislation currently in the country, and they have, powerful lobby money behind it. What if, and this is not far-fetched, this has happened obviously most sort of clearly in Florida, but it's going to happen elsewhere. What if that kind of speech gets sort of deemed problematic or hurtful to the sentiments of other students? Are we not going to put up trans flags? Are we not going to put up pride flags on our doors? Are we not going to say this is a safe space for students? We know we've faced this under Trump before, that we have undocumented students, workers, others in our community. And if there is another immigration ban, or if there's another Muslim ban, are we not allowed to show solidarity? This is, as Anthony was saying, sometimes that's all you can do, to say, look, I am human. I am here for my queer students. I am here for my undocumented students. I am here for, the most vulnerable in our community. And if my signage is going to make someone feel uncomfortable, then that is a moment of conversation, rather than shutting it down and saying, campus is not the space for it, right? So rather than actually doing the work of making conversation possible, even when it is uncomfortable, we're just shutting it down unilaterally, top down. And certainly, I don't think anyone with sort of the educational, pedagogical sort of good of the university will share that goal.
It's so anti-intellectual. How are you anti-intellectual at a college? That's so bizarre. But Anthony, I think you were gonna chime in. I heard you begin to speak, I believe. Yeah, go ahead.
Shayoni, I love the way you're saying what you're saying, and I'm so glad you agreed last minute to rearrange your day to be here. And so there's another level to this, and that's the absolute hypocrisy. VP Rosberg from Columbia University, on camera, was walking around New York City putting up posters of some of the hostages that were civilians captured by Hamas, which I will say, targeting and killing a civilian and taking a civilian hostage is a war crime. So maybe there are some on the left that disagree, but that's the definition, although Israel has done it far more. But it's never okay. And I have no problem with him putting up those pictures, except he was in violation of New York law. You can't just put posters anywhere you want in New York City. So when it's convenient for folks who are part and parcel to these suppression of free speech rules that keep getting made at the drop of a hat, mysteriously we just decided to do them. When you yourself are walking around breaking codes and laws in New York to get your viewpoint, by the way, I fully support it. Put a poster anywhere you want. I believe in freedom of speech. I have no problem with him doing that. But you're going to tell your own students they can't do it on their own damn dorm door? What? That is the ultimate hypocrisy. And then the message comes out, which is you can be free, but not fully. You can say anything you want except this. We believe in the humanity of Palestinians, but not fully. Our conversations where we want to talk about it, but not everything. Wasn't somebody banned? It's happened a couple of times from speaking at our university, Shayoni, at Columbia, about an event, and they canceled the event. And so, but here's the thing, and I said this last time we talked about it, Jay. If I were advising the school, I would let them know what you're doing is dumb. Because if you really want to silence someone, don't suppress them. It only inflames things and it only makes us louder.
And, I think yes to all of this. And there's one crucial aspect that we haven't talked about yet, which I think is, again, so fundamental to how much is wrong right now on campuses, which is consistently at Barnard and Columbia, what we have seen is students are getting disciplined in ways that they haven't before. And this goes back to your question, Jay, of institutional knowledge. And we've really asked this of our colleagues who've been here longer. Do you remember students being called for disciplinary hearings during, most recently, as Anthony was saying, the anti-apartheid movement of the 80s? There has been divestment sort of referenda before. There has been climate activism before. There was a week in 2016 of student climate activists on law library steps. We certainly remember the movements around campus sexual assault in the early 2010s. In those times, students were not called into disciplinary hearings. And in the numbers and in the ways that we are seeing it now. We are, forget sort of the ability to even protest or counter-protest. Hillary Clinton was having, somewhere in February, she was having this panel on sexual violence. And two of our students and there were some disruptions, some students left, and two of our students got disciplinary notices for just leaving the event. And one of those students was having a health emergency. Since when are we going to sort of put disciplinary infractions on students for leaving something, or saying that this? So it's so one-sided. This, and we keep returning to this point of this clampdown on sort of free speech and academic expression is at levels we just have not encountered before. More than, within a weekend, more than 100 faculty wrote to our president saying, you are about to have disciplinary hearings starting next week. Please pause them and let us first, as faculty, have an ability to discuss this with administration. What are the infractions? What are these hearings going to achieve? Why are we employing a punitive model? As campuses, as New York City residents, we've been having discussions around restorative justice, not just since BLM, but for a long time. And here in the drop of a hat, we're throwing all of that work, decades of conversations and work out, and imposing this punitive model against students for dubious infractions. Firstly, we don't know, and we've had a lot of faculty accompany students to these hearings that are not hearings, that may be conversations, but are kept on the record, and then will be, firstly, there's not clarity around what is the purpose of this. They're framed as conversations, but then also we're told that, records are kept. But there is overwhelming consensus amongst faculty that we should have larger conversations before employing this punitive model of disciplinary sort of action against students. But we don't have, and, in doing all of this, by the way, the administration, both at the Columbia side and the Barnard side, are undoing models of faculty governance that have existed. There are models of shared governance, whether it's the Senate, whether it's faculty meetings or committees. They're undoing all of this and issuing these top-down sort of really punishments on our students. Even if there is no consequence to a hearing, the fact that you have summoned a student to a hearing is itself distressing. These are students, these are already students who for many reasons are vulnerable. Many of them have been involved, let's face it, for months of activism and are exhausted emotionally, physically, facing financial instability. They're worried about their scholarships. They're worried about their visa statuses. to say that there's, it's just a conversation, there's nothing is going to come out of it, is not recognizing the harm you're already doing in invoking this model on and sort of imposing this on our students.
There's two things that I take from two major things. There's a lot that you had there that was good, but there's what we're seeing is a cracking in the illusion, the mirage of a democracy. We don't have a democracy, and all of us are the Truman. We're Truman discovering the set of our life. We're hitting that set. We're like, what is this wall here? When he got to the end of the set on Truman, if you ever watched the Truman Show, he gets to the end of the set. He doesn't know he's on the set. So that's literally what it feels like. The narrative control because of the internet has been a problem. Obama has made reference to this, and losing narrative control is what we're seeing. The results of that, or trying to regain narrative control, let me say it that way, is what we're seeing on college campuses. All of the repression acts that they're trying to do is them trying to regain all of the sort of repression and censorship on social media, the apparent banning of TikTok. These are all to control the narrative, because they're like, this is literally this whole thing with this genocide of Palestine. They didn't realize this was this big gap in difference between the young and they didn't know that. So they were generally, and I think honestly, surprised by it. They always say, the younger crowd is a little bit anti-war, but then eventually they grow into understanding. They don't feel like on this issue that's going to be happening. You're not going to grow into being a Zionist from here. And then the other thing I wanted to say about, if there's all of this anti-Semitic students, who's raising these anti-Semitic students? Where are these anti-Semitic students coming from? Like, what I'm saying is basically is it like, are these parents? So the parents who are pro-Israel, they're raising anti-Semitic students? Like, how is that happening? I'm only saying that to point out that, of course, these incidents that are being labeled anti-Semitic are not anti-Semitic. You're just against the Zionist project, and it's being lumped together as some sort of there's no outsized anti-Semitic problem on college campuses that's any different than any other marginalized group, is what I'm saying. There's no outsized problem that they're trying to create, that there's some sort of hyper existence of anti-Semitism that goes far and beyond every other thing. This is the reason why we got to have a task force at your campus and not for any other group, because this problem of anti-Semitism goes far and beyond any other issue. And that's because they're labeling anti-genocide, anti-Zionist protests with being anti-Semitic. They're just broad. It seems like every year they add something new to what is called anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism. Those are my final words on it, but I think both of you wanted to chime in one more time. Go ahead, whoever wanted to go.
I'll say this. I will say that anti-Semitism is real, and there's a threat of anti-Semitism, yes, but it's from the neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us. Mm-hmm. There is a real and present danger of that in the US, but we are attributing the wrong causes and the wrong sort of, not the wrong causes, as much as misidentifying where that threat is coming from. Right. And I don't think pro-Palestinian protests are necessarily the most, they're not where the anti-Semitism in the US, I think, is being encouraged. Right. And
cultivated. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
And to your point, Jay, of like the generational divide of the Zionist project and the younger generation maybe not being quite as sort of in the same way as a part of it. A colleague of mine literally wrote an op-ed because she was approached by two Jewish students, and this is a Jewish faculty member, who were trying to show the film Israelism on campus. And it's a film that, basically talks about generational differences. And what literally happened was she had to write an op-ed because it was such a difficult process, and our college president nearly canceled it last minute. So again, it goes back to the same, we're not able to have the kinds of nuanced, difficult conversations that we should be having, and instead instituting sort of clampdowns that are not helping anybody.
Anthony,
George Orwell, yeah, everything Shayoni said. And yeah, George Orwell, Animal Farm. All animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others, right? So they'll give lip service to the fact, oh, we don't want bias on campus. We don't want violence or violent speech or hate speech. We don't want it, but we're only going to look at this is what we elevate and emphasize. I mean, those that are called to speak up against the inhumanity that is being perpetrated against the people of Palestine are very clear that they understand their role. We are born on this planet at this point in time, and we have a choice to remain silent or not. And what we do literally affects the lives of others. And that's a heavy thing to throw at a 20-year-old undergraduate who's weighing whether or not their actions are going to impact their career. By universities suppressing speech, not taking violence against pro-Palestine protesters seriously, and giving more, elevating the speech of others more, what they're doing is giving space to those that are doing even more extreme things, like the doxing trucks, because it's all part of the same belief system. You stepped out of line. You spoke up against something that we don't want you to speak up against. So we're going to make sure these doxing trucks, you're not going to get a job. You're going to be humiliated. You're going to be traumatized. And the school, they're not doing that, but they're doing all these other things, which are part of the same belief system that some speech is more free than others. And that is unacceptable. And to Shayoni's point from before, if you don't think that they're going to use this playbook again, that's just foolish. Of course they will. And they'll have space to use it. And it's the same way I feel about what's happening to the folks in Gaza. If we allow this to happen and we don't stop it, and or we don't hold accountable those who made this possible, the Biden administration and everybody who cheerleaded this this genocide, if we don't do that, they're going to do it again. They're going to do it again, and they will do it again to another voiceless people who will be dehumanized and demonized. So, we have the choice. We could just kind of whistle past it and decide not to speak out. But for those of us who take our humanity and the humanity of others seriously, that's no longer a choice. And I've referred to this before. I have a colleague who I like and respect, who basically, and I'm paraphrasing, when this all started, the protest movement, sometime in October, November, we had a conversation, and they basically said, I wish it would just stop. There's other things to protest about. There's other things to worry about in the election. And this is not a person I don't respect. It was just this wish it weren't happening. And, it's that old way of looking at it. If talk of genocide makes you uncomfortable, imagine what it's like to be genocided. So I get that it's not comfortable to hear these things, and we wish it weren't so. We wish this wasn't happening, and yet it is. So I guess a message to all of those who wish it would go away, I think they're starting to realize it's not. And if this all stopped tomorrow, this is still an issue, you know?
Mhm.
And I'll throw one other thing is that these students that I'm hearing, they're not keyed into the electoral politics game as being the only way they can express themselves, and they're not beholden to the Democratic Party. I'm hearing this very plainly and clearly. This isn't just about Joe Biden, it's about you are backing a genocide. And that, to me, that's a stain you can't get out. And what I'm so excited about is that the young people who are at the forefront of this movement are going to be the ones that make sure that that stain doesn't come out, that we hold people accountable, and that we remember, you know. And the only way we can do this is in community. And one side note too, that whole thing about poetry, I just want to throw out. There are people, and Shayoni was really eloquent in describing this, who are not feeling well. I had a student drop out. I was sad and disappointed. I wish they hadn't. I tried to support them, but this can be overwhelming. And I just want to remind folks to connect with people who see you and be in community. And that's, you know, half the thing about going to a protest. It's not just making your voice heard. It's looking around and saying, I'm not crazy. Other people feel it too. So any way we can do that in small groups or big groups, just to, and that one last thing, I'm sorry, it's going through my brain. That's why being able to display a poem or a Palestinian flag or things like that is important, because it lets other people who feel what you're feeling know that they are seen and that there is a community. And they will not kill that. Just saying that now.
I have actually, and I think this is a really beautiful example to end with. And this is to sort of Anthony's point. I have a really good example for you, which is that last year in the fall, while all of this was going on, I was teaching a class on student activism to first-year students. And, you know, it's a self-selecting. It's one of the, all first years at Barnard have to take a seminar, but they can pick what topic. And so it's, in some senses, a self-selecting crowd that ends up taking a class on student activism. And we had been studying, you know, a lot of histories of sort of Columbia's activism on campus by students, like when they stopped the Morningside campus, the gym being built in Morningside Park. We had studied the anti-apartheid movement. And on one of these occasions, when the protests had started, there was going to be somewhere in November, outside groups, not just student campus, but within our lifetime and others had announced a protest outside on 116th and Broadway in support of, you know, the student groups that had been suspended. And we got this email from VP of Public Safety, I think, which was basically a laundry list of all the things that students shouldn't do, like be mindful of where you walk, don't talk to strangers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And it was really around sort of, you know, how to be fearful around protests. And so, of course, I took this, and we got it minutes before class started. So we were all reading it together. And that classroom, remember that this is a class of first semester, first year students. Most of them were not from New York City. A fair number of them were from small towns or rural areas who'd never really encountered big protests before. And this, you know, to the person, students are like, this is teaching us to fear protests rather than think about them or engage with them. And one of them, and this is the sort of anecdote I love and hold dear to my heart, one of them said, you know, this whole line about look over your shoulder and don't talk to strangers, that's often how you meet people of like interest. And this is to Anthony's, you know, I'm not crazy. I'm out here raising my voice, and you find other people who are kindred spirits who are also feeling the same way. And protests are often the way to find your people that you might not immediately have in your immediate circumstance. And so, really, like, there's so much learning to be had from all of these sort of moments of activism and large scale popular sort of social movements and protest movements. And we have to make sure, I mean, they're all led by young people anyway, and they're doing great. And I always say this, the students are like light years ahead of us in terms of organizing and how they're thinking. But we have to really, really, really fight to defend these spaces and opportunities for our students. I think I've shouted this out before, but I run something called Palestine Poetry Collective, and we have a little site, and it's really basic, but as you will see if you scroll down, we just have a collection of resources for people. We have the readings. We've now met over 15 times, and I'm thinking, this is more than a semester's work. We publish all of our readings on here. We have Palestinian poetry, art, films, writing, music. We're really trying to, and this is sort of a community resource. You can find us, email us, and we grow it, based on sort of community input. And the last thing I will say, I was involved in this yesterday, but it's a continuing project. We had an event on campus about the Freedom Theater, which is based out of Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. And it goes back to exactly everything that's already been said today, where my friends in the West Bank are saying they're at the receiving end of a slow genocide that is not being televised in the same ways. And so really, I cannot stress this enough, to think of Gaza, to keep West Bank in our mind, and finding ways of uplifting Palestinian voices, supporting work that Palestinian artists are doing right now. They were talking about, my friends in the Freedom Theater, they work with kids, and they said we had to do winter camp with them. And on the days that the army entered Jenin, they had to cancel those days, but the families would call up and say, can you reschedule camp days? Because that's the only space kids have in Jenin right now. And so we really do everything we can to find Palestinian voices and uplift them and make space for them in whatever ways we can, and support the incredible sort of death-defying work that they're doing every day.